The opening Mishnah discusses the chiyuv of bedikas chametz and the significant machlokas rishonim why bedik indeed is necessary, because the Sugyot daf daled mabeis midaraisa bittul ba'al masagi. Why is bedika necessary? So Tosfos writes a concern of shemiyavo lidei achila. When you look at the Ran, daf aleph meralef and dape harif, the Ran goes a step further. Not only is that what is driving the chiyuv of bedika, but the Ran writes a studying chiddush that that's why the Torah has the isurim of bariol and balimatzei. That bariol and balimatzei is a siyag daraisa atu achila. That no doubt is a very, very great chiddush. One could have argued that the isurim of bariol and balimatzei are standalone, independent isurim, unrelated to isur achila. When you look in the Rambam, Perikid Beis, the Hilchos Avodah Zarah, and the Rambam describes why you can't own Avodah Zarah, it is not just simply a siyag to Avodah Zarah itself, but rather it's a to'eva, to go ahead and to bring Avodah Zarah into your home, the Sugyot of Avodah Zarah and Daf Yud Zayin. And here the Ran writes, the Chiddush, that bariol b'matzah is considered to be a siyag daraisa atu achila. If you look, for example, in Rabbi Yosef Engel, Lekach Tov Siman Ches, Rabbi Yosef Engel has 16 examples of a siyag daraisa, and you know what? He focuses on this bariol b'matzah, that Chiddush indeed, that the Ran writes. That's very nogeya for many of the sugyas indeed that you're going to learn, the relationship between bariol b'matzeh and indeed the isur achila. There is a machlokas rishonim, we'll see later, the sugya daf membeis, about whether there's an isur bariol b'matzeh when it comes to taruvos chametz. Rabbi Nutam's shita is there's only an isur bariol b'matzeh when you're dealing with chametz gomer that you're chayiv kares ba'achila. Because after all, number one could argue a siyag daraisa, but a siyag daraisa atu achila sheish bo kares. And the Rambam writes that there's an isra bariol b'matzeh on teruvos chametz. That Rambam is chametz v'matzah daled ches. The Maggid Mishnah writes the following chiddush that's not always true. That's only if there's a kazayis toked achilas pras. That's the chiddush of Maggid Mishnah. So imagine a person can own a kazayis chametz, but it's not, the proportions are not the kazayis toked achilas pras. That would mean that there's no possibility of an isser achila, and therefore, even though you own a kazayis chametz, you're not going to be chayiv for bariol and b'matzeh in those cases. That would seemingly indicate that the Rambam maintains, perhaps like the Ran, that it is indeed a siyag daraisa. And when you look in the Rambam Perek Aleph of chametz amatzah, the Rambam writes, if a person is maniach chametz b'shuso b'pesach, you'll violate two isur daraisa, bariol and b'matzeh, and the Rambam adds the phrase, v'af al pi shlo achla. Even if you don't end up eating it. Well, of course. You would think that bariol b'matzeh is tali on an isur achila. Perhaps that's exactly the chiddush of the Rambam shita, that indeed that's true. Maybe not a standalone isur, but rather it is a siyag atu achila. That's the chiddush of the Ran. Oh, a chiddush posher pshat of the Rambam as well. There's another Ran that you learn the Shitasei, Daf Yud Gimel Maralef and Dape Harif, where the Ran writes the following. Ran raises the following kasha, unusual kasha. If you have chametz that is nifsa me'achilas adam, you're chayiv for bariol b'matzeh. The Ran writes, why should that be? After all, isn't it a halacha din daraisa that you're only chayiv for a nevela haru'uya leger? It has to be right, l'achilas adam. So how can it be chayiv for bariol b'matzeh if it's something that is not royal l'achilas adam? That's the kasha of the Ran. You know, when you see that kasha, it's stunning. What does nevela royal leger have to do with this for bariol b'matzeh? If something is royal l'achilas behema, bechefs is considered to be chametz, and therefore there's an isra bariol b'matzeh. What type of kasha is it that how can you be chayiv for bariol b'matzeh? It's not something that is royal l'achilas adam. It's not royal leger. You know what I will tell you? That kasha in the Ran is l'shitase. This is a siyag daraisa atu achila, and therefore if something is nifsel me'achilas adam, so why should there be an isra of bariol b'matzeh? If a person is going to eat this, he's not going to be chayiv. That's the kasha around the Shitasei, Daf Aleph and Daf Yud Gimel. And you know what the teretz of the Ran is? That the reason you're chayiv for bariol b'matzeh is because yachal lechamea isos acheres. That it has the potential to cause chimutz. Wow. That's against the Ravid. Because the Ravid Shita is, that's Machokas, the Rambam, the Rabbi, the very beginning of Hilchos Chametz Matzah, that's Svar of Yachol Chamei Achisos Acheros. You know what the Ravid writes? That's not relevant for something which is Nifsem Achilas Adam. That's referring to something which is Nifsel Me'achilas Kelev. If something is nifsem achilas adam, of course you're chayav for bayram matzeh. You don't have to come on to the answer of rai lachamei isos acheros. But if you have something bechefza which is not chametz, it's not even rai lachilas kelev, why should you be chayav? And that, the Ravid writes, is because of yachol lachamei isos acheros. Rav Chaim Ozer writes in Achiezer, Chela Gimel, Siman Hey, that is the machlokas, the Rambam and Ravid. What is the relationship between this bayram by matzeh and this Achila? Is it an independent standalone list, or is it considered to be a siyag indeed, which is atu the Isra Achila in and of itself? You know, there is a fascinating Prima Gadim. The Gemara Beitz on Dav Zayin discusses the Shira Bayram by Matzeh. What is the Shira Bayram by Matzeh? And Shagasari raises the following issue. That's the Machlokas Beisila by Shammai. Whether the Shir by Matzah is a Kazayas, or whether it's a Koseves, no? That's a Mishnah Daf Beis Lamed Aleph, a Gemara Daf Zayin and Beis. What is the Shir of Bayram by Matzah? And the Shagasari raises the following issue. Is there an Isra of Chatzi Shir? Chatzi Shir when it comes to Bayram Matzah. I don't know if you discussed that at all. Is there an Isra of Chatzi Shir? After all, there's a Shir to Bayram Matzah, a Kazayas or a Koseves. But what about Pachos Mikashir? What about Pachos Mikashir? Very unclear from the Sugyos. You know, there is Maram Chalava and Davav Mebeis that raises this as a suffix. There's Maram Chalava and Daf Mem Hey and Daf Mem Hey. Ram Chalava discusses that. Achadush Rabbeinu David earlier in the Masechta and Davav. Shagasari writes that he doesn't think there's an Isra Bayram by Matzah. When it comes to Bayram by Matzah, no Isra of Chatzi Shir. What's his raya? He writes something that's stunning. The Gemara Beitza, Dav Zayin Amud Beis, Machlokas in Beisil Beis Shammai. What is the Shir? Is it a Kazayas or is it a Koseves? What are they arguing about? One would say normally, if you're arguing about the Shir is for a Chiyuv of Malkus. But that, of course, is there Malkus when it comes to Bayram by Matzah? That probably you discussed, no? There are two very good reasons why there shouldn't be Malkus. One is the Chiddush of the Rambam, that Ein Ba Maisa, no, based on Tosefta. The other is the Gemara later, no, that it's Nitek Lesei. That's the Shita of Rashi, that's the Shita of Tosfos. It's a Lava Nitek Lesei. So in such a case, there's no Malkus. If there's no Malkus for Bayram by Matzah, so what is the Machlokes? Whether the Shir is a Kazayas, the Shir is a Koseves, Lamai Nafkamina. Because Shagasari writes that, look, if it's Ein Oloke, and there's an Isra of Chatzi Shir, so everyone agrees that Chatzi Shir is Asa, and everyone agrees that there's no Malkus Bikashir. So in such a case, what exactly is the basis of the Machlokes? So Shagasari writes, he thinks it's a Raya Muchachas, that there's no Isra of Chatzi Shir when it comes to Bayram by Matzah. That's a fascinating possibility. We have to take a look. Shagasari, Siman Pei Aleph. Whether there's an Isra Chatzi Shir when it comes to Bayram by Matzah. I'll tell you the following Chiddush. There's a Prima Gadim. Prima Gadim has a Psicha to Shulchan Aruch. It's called the Psicha Koleles. No, I always suggest that Talmidim learn the Psicha Koleles of the Prima Gadim. It will open your eyes in any sugya that you learn, that the Prima Gadim discusses at length the Klali Hashas. And the Prima Gadim writes the following fascinating Chiddush, that, you know, there's a concept of a siyag, of course. Many Yisuri D'Rabbanan are a siyag, that's clear. And there are even cases of a siyag daraisa. Oh, like this Ran, for example. A siyag daraisa. We know that you can have a siyag, that's true, but you can't have a siyag l'siyag. You can't have a gzeira l'gzeira. Ein gozer gzeira l'gzeira. No? Rashi writes that's an isser, no? After all, the pasuk says, Ushmartim es mishmarti. That's a sugi nivamas and daf chaf aleph. And the Gemara tells us, mishmarti, yes, you can come siyag l'Torah, but lo mishmeres l'mishmeres. You can't have a siyag l'siyag. We usually think that's true when it comes to dinim d'Rabbanan. That you can't have isser d'Rabbanan, A is asr because of B, and B is asr because of C. That's ein gozerin, gzeira, l'gzeira. Pri Megadim raises the following issue. What happens if you're dealing with a siyag daraisa? A siyag daraisa. Can you have gzera l'gzera? Can you have such a gzera l'gzera? What would an example of that be? So Pri Megadim writes the following chiddush. The Ran writes, Ba'ir by Matzeh is a siyag. And the Gemara has, in the Sugya in Yuma, now, and Gimel Beis, and Daled Amud Aleph, Chatzi Shir. Why is Chatzi Shir aser? The Gemara says Chatzi Shir is aser because of Chaziditz Tarufei. Rabbi Kvega writes that's a siyag. Chatzi Shir is aser because Shema Yovedei Achila Bikashir. Those are two fascinating examples of that which is considered to be a siyag daraisa, Chatzi Shir and Ba'ir by Matzeh. Can you put them together? Would there be an isser of Chatzi Shir and Ba'ir by Matzeh? That's the chiddush the Shagasarya discusses, but that's the teretz of the Pri Megadim, the Psicha Kalalas, Aleph Yud Zayin, that you can't have a siyag, even if each siyag is considered to be a din daraisa. Ba'ir by Matzeh is a siyag daraisa to achila, and Chatzi Shir is considered to be a siyag. So he writes a couple of nafkaminas. One is Chatzi Shir and Ba'ir by Matzeh, and the other is Chatzi Shir when it comes to a nazir of Mishras Anavim. A nazir obviously cannot be Shosa Yayin, but even Mishras Anavim is Aser. That already, the Karma Chalosikra, don't have any part of the sediment of the grape, lest you'll end up being Shosa Yayin. So the Pri Megadim writes the following chiddush: maybe there's no Isser of Chatzi Shir when it comes to Mishras Anavim, and maybe there's no Isser of Chatzi Shir when it comes to Ba'ir Matzeh, because that would constitute a siyag, even though both are considered to be dinim daraisa. That's a powerful chiddush. I once suggested maybe one could split, because when it comes to Kol Torah Kula, Chatzi Shir is aser because of Chazli Sterufei. Why is Chatzi Shir aser when it comes to Chametz Pesach? Did you notice that Rambam in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Chametz Hamatzah? The Rambam writes, if you eat chametz b'kashir, you're chayav kares. And the Rambam writes that Chatzi Shir is aser. Why is that true? The Rambam quotes Gzeras HaKasav. V'lo yeyachel chametz. No? You ever notice that? The Rambam has a Gzeras HaKasav that Chatzi Shir is aser when it comes to chametz. That's something which is stunning. That even though Chatzi Shir is aser b'chol Torah Kula, that's Yuma Daf Ayin Dalet, but nonetheless, Chatzi Shir is aser on chametz. It's a separate Gzeras HaKasav. That Chatzi Shir is considered to be aser. In which case one could argue, even though it's true that b'chol Torah Kula, Chatzi Shir may only be an Isser Siyag, but not necessarily true when it comes to Chatzi Shir regarding Chametz Pesach. That the Rambam writes is a Gzeras HaKasav, v'lo yachal chametz. And I would suggest another nafkamina. There's a Rambam in Hilchos Shvuos, Perakei Halacha Zayin, where the Rambam writes, if you're dealing with the typical Isser of Chatzi Shir, a Shvua is chal on Chatzi Shir. Chatzi Shir is not mushba v'omed mehar sinayu. The Rambam writes that based on the Gemara in Shvuos and Avchav Gimel Beis, that even though a person cannot make a Shvua, levatel es mitzvah, and even a Shvua lekayim es mitzvah is not fully chal, the Gemara seems to imply that a Shvu is chal on a Chatzi Shir, Maybe that's only true when it comes to Chatzi Shir b'chol Torah Kula. When it comes to Chatzi Shir Chametz, that the Rambam writes, that's the pasuk of Lo Yachal Chametz. In such a case, maybe that would be called Nishba L'Kaim or Nishba L'Vatel. It's a mitzvah. That's a chiddush. Take a look at that Rambam, Perek Aleph, and the Rambam Hilchos Shvuos, Perakei Halacha Zayin. But again, there's an Isser of Ba'ir by Matzeh, and the chiddush of the Ram that Ba'ir by Matzeh are forbidden because of siyag, which is Atu Achila. If you look in the other Rishonim, here, the opening of Maseches Psachim, they give very different reasons why, indeed, we argue that a chiyuv b'dika is necessary. The chiddush of the Ran, that enochinami, it's true, midaraisa bitl b'masagi, daldim lebeis, but I'm concerned, maybe a person will not be mevatel the chametz b'leiv shalem. That means from the get-go, from the outset, he will not do it necessarily with the proper mindset, with the proper das, and therefore b'dika is necessary. But then if you look in the Rimi Lunil, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, the Rimi Lunil writes the following chiddush, that no, a person was mevatel the chametz properly. He engaged in bittul properly. But you know what? All of a sudden, during Pesach, he chances upon a gluska yafa. And all of a sudden he's drawn to it. Dai tilave. If that happens, you know what? He's going to undermine the bittul. Wow, undermine the bittul. Shemi malach achar bitulo. Not what the Ran writes, that originally the bittul was not done properly. The bittul was done properly, But you know what? It's a slippery slope. That can change. All of a sudden, it's the middle of Pesach and you're drawn to. So in such a case, you could be chayiv. Realize what a great chiddush indeed that is. That even though I was mevatel my chametz, you know what? That could be subject to change. Because if I'm drawn to, it is something that rotzani. For that, you could be chayiv for bayram b'matzeh. Why would that be? Imagine a person is mafkir an object, and all of a sudden he's desirous of retaining it. It doesn't become his. Just because now he's desirous of, he has to be kone, he has to reacquire. Oh, but that Rimi Lanil writes, that's not true when it comes to chametz. Why exactly is that the case? That I would suggest is based on the very fundamental machlokas and daf daled modeis, that why is it that we assume midaraisa bittul b'masagi? That I'm sure you've seen discussed at great length. No? Why midaraisa bittul b'masagi? What does the word sagi mean? It's enough to do what? It's enough for what? So the chiddush of Rashi, the chiddush of the Rambam, that's how Targum translates the pasuk. That's the meaning of tashbisu. Ach b'yam rishon tashbisu, Targum translates as tevatlun. That's what tashbisu means. The pasuk does not say tevaru. The pasuk says tashbisu. And in such a case, midaraisa bittul b'masagi, and al yedei bittul, you're fulfilling the chovas tashbisu. And as you know, Tosfos disagrees and argues that certainly is not true. Tashbisu requires a form of biur, either b'chol davar or Rabbi Yehuda only al yedei sreifa, but biur is necessary. So how can the Gemara say midaraisa bittul b'masagi? You know what sagi means? It's enough to avoid the isurim of bayram b'matzeh. It doesn't mean that thereby you're mekayim the mitzvah of tashbisu, but rather it means that if you're mafker your chametz, in such a case you will not be chayiv. And why is that true? That's the sugyot learned of Hamud Beis, because shelcha iyataroah, avla torah shelachim v'shel gavoah. You're only chayiv from bayram matzeh if the chametz is yours. If it's not yours, you're not going to be chayiv. So therefore, you're mavata your chametz. That is an act of hefker. It leaves your reshus, and therefore there's no violation of bayram matzeh. As of yet, though, you didn't fulfill the chovas tashbisu. And the Ramban at length, kash after kash after kash against Tosfos. How can you assume that that's true? That bittul really is mitam hefker? The Ramban writes, it sounds like it's against so many sugyas. No, nedar mandaf mem gimel, nedar mandaf mem hey, bittul requiring dibur, requiring shlosha, and Rabbi Yossi shita adasi l'shazolche. What happens when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos? The Ramban writes, it's an isser to be mafker something on Shabbos. That also is a chiddush. That's not a Gemara. That it's also lahafkir b'Shabbos. The Miri is mafurish. The Miri in Shabbos and Avkuf Chav Zayin, that hefker is mutter on Shabbos. And the Miri has a separate sefer, Mogen Avos, Simin Yurches, where the Miri writes that again, you can't be makne, you can't be kone, but not necessarily when it comes to hefker. But the Ramban writes, based on kash after kash after kash, it cannot be that bitter really is midin hefker. If it's not midin hefker, so how does it work? A person says the chametz is ka'afra da'ara. I understand, but a person owns something, and he says ka'afra da'ara. His reshus is paka. It's no longer shalo. It's no longer b'shuso. You don't lose your kinyane mamon just because you say something is ka'afra da'ara. And therefore, why would it work when it comes to the case of chametz? So I understand Tosfos Shita, it's midin hefker. But if you assume as other Rishonim, Rashi Shita, the Rambam Shita, the Ramban, so how is it that bittul works if bittul is not considered to be midin hefker? So the Ramban points out there's an incredible paradox, and this I think opens up a world to all of these sugyas, that there's a tension when it comes to the Isra of bayram b'matzeh. And I would have said that the Isra bayram b'matzeh is impossible. It's impossible. On what basis do I assume that that's true? Because a sugya daf Hamud Beis is mentioned, shalcha iyataroeh, avla torah shalachim v'shel gavoah. The Isra is, you cannot possess your chametz. Okay, why is that impossible? You know what the difficulty is? Chametz is asr b'achila. And chametz is asr b'hana. If you have something that is isurei hana, is it really appropriate to say that, you know what, there's a din bailus on Isurei Hana? You know what ownership typically means? Utility. It's mine in order to. The chefetz is completely aser. It's aser ba'achila, it's aser ba'ana, but it's considered to be mine to do what? No, to do nothing. It's aser ba'achila, aser ba'ana, but you have a shem ba'alim on Isurei Hana. Is that really true? There is a ritva, Sukkah Daf Lamed Daled, that quotes the Ravid Shita, you can't be Yotze with an Esrog Shel Orla, because Orla is Aser B'Achila, it's not Lachem. How can you say it's mine if something is Aser B'Hana? And even if you argue doing a mitzvah is not called Hana, because mitzvah slav lahenos nitno, but you can't be Yotze because it's not Lachem. Mefurish and Ravid. The Tosefta says if a person will steal Kelai HaKerem, there's no Chiyuv. Because Klai HaKerem is Asra B'Achila, Asra B'Ana. If I take it out of your Rishus, how is it Motzim Rishus HaBailim? How is there Bailus and Isurei Hana? That's a Ksos and Simin Tavav. Bailus and Isurei Hana, but that's the Ramban. In Psachim and Avdalit. So if there's no Bailus and Isurei Hana, and the Torah says you're only Chayiv for Bar Matzah and Chametz, which is yours, so how do you reconcile that difference? On the one hand, the Chefetz is Nesar, there's no din bailim, but you're only chayiv for shalcha iyataroa, havatzor shelchem v'shel gavoa. Well, so you know what the Ramban writes? This was not my problem. I didn't create this dilemma. This tension is not mine. That is exactly the sugya in Psachim daf vav medbeis, babakama daf chavtes, right? Either in the name of Rabbi Loza, the name of Rabbi Shmuel. Take a look in the two Masechtas now. Shnei dvarim, eino b'shusa shel adam, v'asa akasav kihilir b'shusa. Wow. That's exactly the dilemma. There is something which really, technically speaking, is eno b'shusa, but aso akasav kilu b'shusa. Aso akasav kilu b'shusa. What are those two cases? For b'shusa rabim and chametz Pesach. What exactly does that mean? Eno b'shusa shel adam and aso akasav kilu b'shusa. So I'll tell you an incredible maramaka. I don't know if you saw this. Did you see the Tosus Chachmei Anglia? Psachim Vav Beis? You have a Kovitz? No? It's in the Kovitz. No? Tosus Chachmei Anglia, Psachim Vav Beis. That Kash and Teretz Tosus is going to open up your mind. You're going to learn all of Maseches Bava Kama differently. Because of a couple of lines in the Tosus Chachmei Anglia, Psachim Vav Beis. Did Rabbi mention that Ramako? Not yet. No. So run after Shir. Show them this Tosas Chachmei Anglia. Vav Beis. You know what the kasha of the Balei Tosas is? Something stunning. Rabbi Loza, Rabbi Shmuel, they're bothered that what? Something is Eno Shelo in your Chayiv? And there are only two examples. Bor, and Chametz. You ready for the kasha? A simple kasha? No? They're already anticipating the answer. This is heavy. No? Tosas Chachmei Anglia, Vav Beis. What about Eish? A person lights a fire. Isn't he chayiv? It's pasuk in Chumash, no? Isn't he chayiv? Of course he's chayiv, no? You mean to say that you have to own the flame? You have to own the gacheles? Is that really true? Tosas writes, you know what? It does not mean that in Dini Mamonos you have to own the Eish. Tosas says it means a Din Mamon. Okay, I understand. But you don't have to own the fire. And if a person sets a fire, he's chayiv. So why was Rabbi Yishmael only bothered by Bor and not bothered by Eish? That's the kasha. That's the kasha of the Balei Tosas. You ready for the teretz? The teretz will blow you away. And the teretz will mean that now you have to relearn one sugi after another in Maseches Bava Kama. You know what the teretz is? You ready? A person shoots a gun. Rahman al-San, he takes a life. Imagine his defense is, the gun was not mine. The bullet was not mine. You're going to turn to the person and say, you're not chayiv because you own the weapon. You're not chayiv because you own the gun, you own the bullet. You're chayiv for a meiser etzicha. A meiser etzicha. No, isn't that obvious? No? Oh. So Tosas Chachman writes the following dichotomy. It's something which is stunning. Why are you chayiv when it comes to Eish? You know what the pasuk says? Shalom Yishalem Hamavir. You're chayiv because you set the fire. You're not chayiv because you own the fire. You're chayiv because you set the fire. Okay? What about when it comes to bor? You know what the pasuk says? Baal habor yishalem. Baal habor yishalem. You're not chayiv because of the ma'aseh hezek, of uncovering or digging the bor. You're chayiv because Baal habor yishalem. Baal habor yishalem. That's an incredible hagdara. That in bor you're chayiv because you're the Baal habor, and in eish you're chayiv because you are the mavir. You are the mavir. I'll tell you, it's sumuduik in Lashon HaGamra, Bavakama Daf Memtes. The pasuk says, Ki yiftach yishbor, Ki yiftach yishbor. Al iskei psicha, al iskei kriya, either for uncovering or for digging, I would have said chayiv. That's not the Lashon HaGamra. Al iskei psicha, al iskei kriya, ba'alo, ba'alo. You know what ba'alo means? It becomes yours. It becomes yours. You're chayiv because you're the Baal habor. You're the Baal habor. I'll tell you, for example, a sugyan Bavakama Daf Samach, the Gemara raises the following issue. What happens if liba v'libsa haruach? What happens if, I'm igniting a flame, but I can only do so because there's a gust of wind that propels it? Okay. Liba v'libsa haruach. The Gemara has a stunning suffix. No, is that called grama or is that called a maisa? Is that called a grama or a maisa? After all, I did something, but it was al yedei koach acher. It wasn't exclusively me. It was done al yadi, but also al yedei haruach. Is that called a maisa? Is that called a grama? And the Gemara brings an incredible raya. Well, of course it's called a maisa. Haraya, the malach on Shabbos of Zoreh of Ruach Mesayata. So you see, Ruach Mesayata is not called a grama, it's called a maisa. You know what the Gemara answers? Meleches machsheves asratav. Wow. That's Malchokas Rashi in the Rosh, what the teretz of the Gemara is. Rashi writes, Meleches machsheves means maybe it is a grama, but on Shabbos you're chayiv because is ovid machshavta. Wow. That's an incredible marmakom where Meleches machsheves is a basis of chiyuv. We usually view Meleches machsheves as a basis of ptur. Here the Gemara says you're chayiv because of Meleches machsheves. That's unusual. That's unusual. The Rosh writes that's not what the Gemara means. That Shabbos is different. You know what the Gemara means? Zoreh is different. That's the Meleches machsheves of Zoreh. Zoreh by definition is done al yedei haruach, so that is not called a grama. But when you do that which is done usually shelo al yedei ruach, and you do it al yedei haruach, maybe that's called a grama. So the Gemara suggests something which is stunning. If there are two forces that set a fire, maybe you're not chayiv whatsoever. Tosfos writes that would mean if two people go ahead and create an eish, maybe you're not going to be chayiv. Maybe you're not going to be chayiv. That sounds stunning. Let me ask you the following. Let's assume, for example, a tree falls. And you know what? You take one end, I take another end, and we lift it together. And by doing so, all of a sudden now there's a cavity in the ground. There's a bor b'rshus harabim. Imagine it causes a hezek. We're pater. You know what the answer is? We're both chayiv. We're both chayiv. You know what that means? What is called a grama in eish is called shutfus in bor. You hear that? No? That's like pretty stunning. No? A grama in eish is shutfus in bor. That's clear. No? The Tosfos and Davav and Bavakama. No? So you know what that means? That both of us do it together. Oh, maybe you're pater in eish, but you're chayiv in bor. It's a joint chiyuv in bor, but in eish not. Why exactly is that true? You know what I would tell you? Because the mechayiv of eish is shamir mavir. If something is done al yidei koach acher, who is the mavir? And if one would argue, not me, not you, you know what? There's no chiyuv. But in bor, you're chayiv because you are the Baal habor. You can have bailus which is exclusive. I own something exclusively, or I own something together with you. If you have a case of a shnaim shnasu when it comes to bar, in such a case, of course, each one of you is going to be jointly chayiv. Wow, a very, very fundamental difference between eish as opposed to bor, and the list would go on and on. You can take a look at the Berch Shmuel in Bavakam and Siman Yud Zayin that writes the uniqueness of eish because you're chayiv b'toras mavir, and the contrast that in bor you're chayiv because of Baal habor yishalem. Okay, so I ask you the following. Is there any contradiction in the chiyuv of eish? Of course not. No, why is there a tension? You're chayiv for setting a fire. The fire is not yours. Why is that a paradox? Why is that problematic? But you know what is a paradox? That's your Gemara, Psachim Davav. A bor b'rshus harabim. A bor b'rshus harabim is not yours. And yet the Torah says when it comes to bor, you're chayiv because Baal habor yishalem. Baal habor yishalem. That's paradoxical. If this bor would be b'rshusi, then the halacha would not be that way. If the bor is b'rshus harabim, which I do not own, then I am chayiv. And I'm chayiv b'torah's Baal habor. How can you call a person a Baal habor for creating a bor b'rshus harabim? You know what the answer is? Wow. Also, koso, killer b'shuso. You see, when it comes to bor, it's something that's fascinating. That, you know what? Bailus is not defined by shalin b'shusi, as it is b'chol Torah kula, but there's a different hagdara of the Baal habor, of the Baal hachefetz. Normally, Baal hachefetz is defined by kinyanei mamon. When it comes to bor, that's absolutely not true. You have no kinyanei mamon at all, but the Torah deems you the Baal habor. Why? Because ki yiftach, ki yichre, aliske psicha, aliske kriya, balo. So bor is a fascinating model where the Torah posits a din bailus even though you don't have any kinyanei mamon. You know what that's called? Aso akasu kila b'shusa. That's fascinating for Bava Kama. That'll be the Sugyot of Samach, Sugyot of Chav Beis, with many, many different nafkaminas as well. How does it relate to us? That's the Ramban's paradox when it comes to Bar Yom Matzeh. Bar Yom Matzeh is Asr B'Achin, it's Asr B'Hana. If that really is true, if it's Nesar, you don't have kinyanei mamon. You don't have kinyanei mamon if something is Nesar. And yet the Torah says that you're chayiv because you are the Baal HaChametz. Sholcha i'ataroa, aval Torah shalachem v'shal gavoa. You're chayiv b'Torah's bailim, even though the chefetz is Nesar and there's no bailus and Yisrei Yana. How do you resolve that clash? You know what the answer is? Aso akasav kilir b'shuso. That is a different hagdara of bailus and kol Torah kula. And where is the other case where this is true? Bor b'shus harabim, where you're the Baal habor without kinyanei mamon, you're the Baal hachametz without kinyanei mamon. That's the chiddush of that Tosas Chachmei Anglia. That's the Ramban. So I ask you the following. Well, look, if it's not based on kinyanei mamon, what exactly is it based on? When do we argue you are considered to be the Baal hachametz? What does the Ramban write? Rotzani b'chiyumo. Is there nichusa? Are you desirous? Are you desirous of? Is there an attachment to this chametz? You don't need kinyanei mamon, but rather, if indeed there is a desire, rotzani b'kiyumo, for that you're considered to be chayiv. Wow. And that is what the Ramban writes is the yesod of bittul. You know what bittul is? Eini rotzeh b'kiyumo. When I say something is ka'afar da'ara, I'll go a step further. When my mindset is something is ka'afar da'ara, even if I don't say anything at all. If I own something, and you know what, believe I feel this is worthless, you don't relinquish kinyanei mamon. Kinyanei mamon are not paka because in my mind it is not something that is worthy, that is worthwhile. Why all of a sudden is that good when it comes to chametz? That hashpasa, believe he hashpasa? You know what the answer is because the definition of the Baal HaChametz is not kinyanei mamon, but rather it is nichusa, aso akaso kili b'shuso, bamed ramurim, rotzini b'kiyumo, and bittul is eini rotze b'kiyumo, eini rotze b'kiyumo. And that's why there's no need for dibur, there's no need for shlosha. No one would say that ada aslir shazoche. That, of course, is allowed even on Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos because you're not working with mekach or memkar kinyanei mamon, but rather a mindset of eini rotze b'kiyumo. That's forbidden on Shabbos. Certainly not. That's the chiddush of Rashi, and that's the shita of the Ramban. There's the Gon in Shulchan Aruch, Taf Mem Gimel. Now take a look. The Mechaber writes the following: Pesach is coming, and there's chametz of a fellow Jew in my rishus. Whoa. You know what the Mechaber writes? It's a time bomb. Get rid of it. It's going to explode. No? If you just sit back, there's going to be Yisra Bar Yom Matzeh. So get rid of that chametz, even though it's chametz, which is Eino Shalcha. It's his chametz, not my chametz. Whoa. Why is that necessary? Why do I have a responsibility to get rid of his chametz? You know what Magen Avram writes? To save him from Bar Yom Matzeh. Yeah, there's a chiv of arvus, no? So I'm going to sit back and do nothing. He's going to violate Bar Matzeh. That's not right. And therefore, in order to save him from this Bar Matzeh, therefore, destroy that chametz. Because it's chemso shel Yisrael, b'shusi, okay? You take a look at the Gon, Taf Mem Gimel. You know what the Gon writes? Ayin Rashi, Psachim Hema Beis. Wow, you know, the Mamar Komos of the Gaon speak volumes. What Rashi? When the Gemara says Shalcha Iyataroeh, Avatar Shalachem Rishal Gavor, Rashi writes Shalacherim is Nachri. You're not chayiv for chametz shel akum b'shuscha. The Gaon is medayik that you would be chayiv for chametz of Yisrael, even without Kabbalah Sachrayis. Even without Kabbalah Sachrayis. Wow. How can that be? I understand if I'm a Kabbalah Sachrayis, maybe you can say the chametz is considered to be shali. Without Kabbalah Sachrayis whatsoever, you know what? That I allow you to go ahead and to place it in my reshus, but clearly I assume no responsibility whatsoever. The Gaon writes that you're chayiv for bayram matzeh. That's Rashi Shita. Why is that true? I'll tell you that's Rashi L'Shita say. Now that Tashbisu is fulfilled, Ayidei Bittul. How does that work? Hashpasa, Bleifi Hashpasa. That's the Hagdara of the Ramban, that Bailus and Chametz Pesach does not require Kinyan Mamon. It just requires a nichusa, a vested interest, an interest. And the Gaon is Machadish and Rashi Shita, that interest does not have to be formal Kabbalah Sachrayis. You know, the Gemara that you learned, Daf Hey Amud Beis, when it comes to a case of a shomer can be chayiv for bayram by matzeh. No? But you know what's unclear from the Gemara? What type of shomer are we speaking about? The Gemara says a shomer, yes. But what type of shomer? You know what? All the possible shitas are found in the Rishonim. When you look in the parsha of Shomrim, you have a shomer chinam, you have a shomer sachar, you have a shoel. All 3 days are found in the Rishonim. You have the shita of the Gaon, the shita of Rashi, a shomer chinam. The shomer chinam. Oh, the Rambam writes the Chiddush, no, Perek Dalet of Chametz Matzah, a shomer sachar, wow. A shomer chinam, no. You have to have the Kabbalah Sachrayis of a shomer sachar. There's a stunning Meiri, I don't know if you saw that, no, Hilchos Chirus, Beis Gimel, where the Meiri writes, oh, this is the Shitase of that Rambam. Oh, because the Rambam Hilchos Chirus writes that, you know what? Even though there are no chiyuvei shmira when it comes to karka. It's not true if you're posheya. If you ask me to watch karka, and I'm posheya, I'm chayi. Why is that true? The Rambam writes because posheya maziku. Pshia is not an act of chiyuv shmira, but rather avoid a hezek. When I speak about the active chiyuvei shmira, that begins with a shomer sachar. A shomer chinam is only chayiv in pshi, and the Rambam writes that's poshem aziku. Wow. So the Meiri writes, and Daf Hey, that Rambam in Chametz Matzah is l'shita seif al chaschiris. That's a very great chiddush. That's true. And there's some Rishonim that assume that in order to be chayiv for bayram matzeh, you have to have the highest level of shmira. It has to be a shoel. Who says such a thing? Whose sheet is that it has to be a shoel? That's a Tosus and Bav Metzia and Daf Pei Beis and a Tosus and Shuas and Daf Mem Dalet. That you have to be a shoel. What's so unique about a shoel? A shoel is chayiv in onsin. No? How can a shoel be chayiv in onsin? Well, what did you expect the shoel to do? The shoel should have prevented what? Prevented the earthquake, prevented the hurricane. How can anyone be chayiv b'onsin? You know what Tosas writes throughout Shas? B'vakama daf Yud Aleph and beyond, that whenever you have anyone that's chayiv b'onsin, you know what that's a raya of? Kinyanim. If I own something and there's an ones gamur, no fault of my own, an earthquake, a hurricane, but I lose. A Baal HaChefetz will suffer a loss, even if it's a case of ones gamur. How can anyone be chayiv b'onsin? A shoel, a ganav, or a gazlan? You know what the answer is? Kinyanim. A ganav or a gazlan has kinyan enigeva. Kinyan enigeva with a chiyav hashava. Oh, so you know what Tosas assumes? In order to be chayiv for bayram matzeh, you have to have kinyanim. Yeah, bittul mitam hefker. You have to have kinyanim. If a shomer is going to be chayiv, that means the type of shomer that has a kinyan, but also a chayfetz. You know what that means? A shoel. But the Ramban Shita, Rashi Shita, no. In order to be chayiv for bayram matzeh, all you need is a nichusa. You know what? That you have to be a shoel. If you have any level of Kabbalah Sachrayis or any level of nichusa, that's going to be enough in order to have a chiyuv of bayram matzeh. That's a fascinating chiddush of that sugya. On Daf Hey Beis. I'll just tell you one last point. Did you do the sugyas of brachos yet? On Daf Zayin Beis. So not so clear. Now, why it is that the bracha is al bir chametz? Why is it not liv ha'er chametz? The Gemara says, the difference in al and li typically is if something is reshus as opposed to a mitzvah, or I'm not doing it as my mitzvah, but I'm doing so la'acherim, or is it over la'asiyasan, or is it la'achar asiyasan? Now, before Rishon Gemara. Something like tfilas hager, the ger is going to make the bracha after the tefillah. That's why the nusach bracha is al, because li is lahaba mashma. Li is lahaba mashma. Well, Atosus and brachas daf nun aleph, the bracha of al netilas yadayim is because you wash and then you make the bracha. It's la'achar hanatila, so the bracha is al netilas yadayim. Pashup shan, the Gemara that you learned. That's why the nusach bracha is al netilas lulav, because mida agbe nafik be. When you pick it up, you're ready yotzei, and the bracha is after the netila. Wow. So it's kind of difficult. How does al bir chametz fit into that? No, after all, isn't that a classic example of a typical mitzvah where the bracha is recited over l'asiyasan, and therefore the bracha should be lin, the bracha should not be al. So there's an amazing Rambam. No? The Rambam is found in Hilchos Brachos, no, Perek Yud Aleph Halacha Tes Vav. That's where the Rambam writes, no, this is like Tfilas Hager, this is like Netilas Yadayim, where the bracha is la'achar asiyasa. The bracha of al bir chametz is la'achar asiyasa. Why exactly is that true? The Rambam writes very simple, because midaraisa, bittul b'masagi, and that's not mitam hefker, that is the mitzvah of tashbisu. The mitzvah of tashbisu is the hashbasa b'leiv, the mindset, the consciousness that, lo nechli b'kiyumo. You're about to go ahead and engage in bir chametz. And I ask you, what exactly are you doing? You know what you're going to explain to me? You know what? That lo nechale, I am not desirous of possessing any of the chametz. I'm going to search and destroy. You know what the Rambam writes? That's a kiyum of mitzvah tashbisa. And the Rambam writes, that means that the bracha is lachar asiyasa. And the Rambam writes, that's why the nusach bracha is al bir chametz, not liv ar chametz, because that's like the other cases of the Gemara, indeed, where the bracha is lachar asiyasa. That's the Rambam l'shita say that really is the meaning of tashbisu. That's an incredibly important chiddush. Now that li is lahaba, right? Al is something which is lishavar. This doesn't directly have to do with the shir, but there is a Tosus Rabbeinu Peretz. In this daf, Psachim daf Zayin Beis, I want you to take a look. You may be at a bris, and someone's going to ask you to say Dvar Torah, so remember this Dvar Torah, you'll blow people away, you'll tell them the following. The Mo makes a bracha. Okay, Al Hamila, that's good, Psachim daf Zayin, because it's not his son, so therefore it's Al, great. The father makes the bracha of lihachniso. Oh, that's good. That's the father's chiyuv, lihachniso. Oh, but not so good. Because li is always lahaba mashma. When does the father make that bracha? That's the Tosus, the Rebbe of Rabbi the Mila Kuf Lamed Zayin. That's the Rush. It's not over l'asiyasan. What the Mo makes his bracha, the father makes his bracha, and then the Mo does the bris. No. You know what? The Mo makes his bracha, does the bris, and the father makes the bracha of lachniso. The Rush writes, we try to time it after the Mila, before the Priya. No? But Tosa says, it's surprising. The bracha is lehachniso, and the Mo doesn't wait until the bracha is over in order to do the bris. Wow. So why would that be? Psachim daf zayin lahaba mashma. So Tosus Rabbeinu Peretz, fasting chiddush. What do you think is the bris of Avraham Avinu? No, these parshios. What is the bris of Avraham Avinu? The bris of Avraham Avinu is one mitzvah. One mitzvah, the mitzvah bris milah. That's the bris of Avraham Avinu. What do you mean? Yom Chavches, no? Avraham Avinu, Kiyim Kol HaTorah Kula Kodem Shenitzna. No. The bris of Avraham Avinu is holistically all of Taryag mitzvahs. So fascinating, Rabbeinu Peretz, it's also known as Zarua, that you know what? We demonstrate that the bris of Avraham Avinu, the knis of the bris of this Rachanimo, is to see to it that he will emerge and fulfill all the mitzvahs Torah. And in order to demonstrate that that's true, wow, one mitzvah is performed, the mitzvah bris milah, but the balance of all of Targim mitzvahs remains. So after the mitzvah of milah is done, we recite a bracha lahaba mashma for the balance of all Targim mitzvahs. And then Tos Rabbeinu Peretz writes, but this is the Balei Tosos. After all, the gematria of bris is 612. Rabbeinu Peretz on your daf. The gematria of bris is 612, because after all, one mitzvah you fulfilled, but the bris of Avraham Avinu is the balance of Kol Torah Kula, so therefore, lehachnisa bris of Avraham Avinu. That's a pretty powerful Rabbeinu Peretz. Now, if you say it without Rabbeinu Peretz, people are going to think that, it's funny, you're saying gematrias and you're in a gush. And the answer is, no, this is a Rabbeinu Peretz. No, Rabbeinu Peretz from Psachim Dav Zayin. This is heavy. The bris is something which is lahaba mashma. That's something which is critically important. Let me just tell you that Tosus writes, Yivamos Daf Chav Beis, that we're the Zera Avram, Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov. And Tosus writes, Yivamos Chav Beis, that there are two differences daraisa between the word ben and the word zera. Tosus is, by the way, a very technical question. When it comes to achilas truma, kedushin dav daled, what is lashon apostolic? Zera einla. When it comes to yibum, no, Yivamos Chav Beis, the pasuk says, Rachmana litzlan, a person dies without any children, uben einla. Tosa says, what's the difference between zera as opposed to ben? What exactly is the difference between them? So Tosa writes two differences daraisa. One is the following: zera is enduring, zera is everlasting. Zera can mean one generation after another. You're not going to call a great-great-grandson's Ben. You'll call him Zera. Ben means a single generation. So the Torah uses the word Zera. It means something which is continuous. Ben means the next generation, a child. That's it. And Tosas writes a second nafkamina. Ben can be a Ben kosher, and Ben can be a Ben pasul. Zera is only Zera kosher. Each one has a ribui and a miyut. Zera is kosher, but it's enduring. Ben is one generation, it's not everlasting, but even one who was pasul. Wow, that's what Tosas writes, lahalacha. A difference in achilas truma as opposed to cases of yibum. It's so meduyak. That kiv Yitzchak yikar lecha zara. Yitzchak is the Zera Avram. The Zera Avram, that's clear. Yishmael, typically speaking, Yishmael beno. Yishmael is the Ben Avram. That's so important. No, bris milah, lezarach acharecha. Only Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, not Bnei Yishmael, and not Bnei Esav, Eretz Yisrael. Lezarach anasati esaretz azos, only Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov, and not Bnei Yishmael and not Bnei Esav. They are not called the Zera. They are not called the Zera Avram. A Ben Avram, absolutely yes, but not Zera Avram. I'll tell you an amazing marmakom, but you have to take a look. No, Pirush Mishnayis, the Rambam, Nedarim Daf Lamed Aleph. The Rambam writes, how can I prove to you that that's true? That we are the Zera Avram. The Rambam writes something, right? Woo. I want you to show this to your Rabbi also. This Rambam, the Pirush Mishnayis. No, you know what the Rambam writes? Part of the bris ben abasarim. Incredible. Ki ger yezacha beretz lo lahem. V'avadu v'yinos Avraham Yoshana. Avraham Avinu was told, a bris, your zera is going to wander from place to place to place. You are going to suffer. You're going to endure the shibud Mitzrayim. V'avadu v'yinos Avraham Yoshana. The Rambam writes something very simple. Who experienced that? Bnei Yishmael, Bnei Esav. They experienced wandering from place to place to place. They experienced the shibud Mitzrayim. The fact that we wandered, the fact that we experienced shibud Mitzrayim, that is the rayu muchachas, that we are the Zera Avram. Ki ger yazarcha beretz lo lahem. Wow. Sometimes you wonder, you look, for example, the very end of Parshas Chayei, the very end of Parshas Vayishlach. So many psukim in the Torah are devoted to every settlement, every encampment, every city, every community of the Bnei Yishmael and the Bnei Esav. No? If I were to ask you, to list them all to me, you probably wouldn't get it right. No, because we read those psukim so fast. Why is that so important? I have to know every place Bnei Yishmael settled, every place Bnei Esav settled. That's really important. Yeah, that's the Rambam. Every area that they settled is a rayu muchachas that they are not the Zera Avram, because the bris ben abasarim ki ger yezarcha beretz lo lahem. And therefore, the Torah tells us Bnei Yisrael wandered from place to place to place. In real time, that didn't sound like a bracha, but that was an amazing bracha because, Yetzer B'chush Gadol, we emerged as Dam HaNivchar, we received the Torah Hashem. That's something which is absolutely stunning. You have to realize what indeed it means. And therefore, if Bnei Yishmael settled with ease, every city is a Rai Muchachas that they are not the Zer Avram. And if Avram Avinu is called the Zarach Anasatias Arts, it's only ours. It's only ours. The Bnei Yishmael, Bnei Yosef have no claim, no share whatsoever. Maybe Yishmael Beno, the Ben Avram, but not the Zera Avram, not the Zera Avram. The Zera that endures one generation to another is critically important. That's obvious to me when it comes to Yitzchak. Ki v'Yitzchak yikar l'chazara. Yitzchak is the Zera Avram. But let me ask you the following question. What about the next generation? What about the next generation? The Bali Otos is right. The very beginning of Parshas told us. It's amazing. Everything that happened to Avram Avinu happened to Yitzchak. Kol ma'asher Avram ele Yitzchak. Everything that happened. Now, the Bali Otos cite 14 parallels between Avram Avinu and Yitzchak. One of the obvious ones is, Avram Avinu had two sons. One is Zerah and one is a Ben. No? Wow. Yitzchak has two sons. No? One is a Zerah and one is a Ben. No? What was true when it comes to Yitzchak and Yishmael was true when it comes to Yaakov and Esau. Everything replayed itself. That's something which is stunning. So I ask you the following question. Well, I know it's Yitzchak and not Yishmael because it's a pasuk. Kiv Yitzchak yikala chazara. But what about the next generation? Okay, I'm going to tell you one in, one out. How do you know who? Oh, the pasuk says Ki bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. That's the Gemara Sanhedrin Untes. No, bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. Bi Yitzchak v'lo kol Yitzchak. Okay, one in, one out. Two sons, one Zerah, one's a Ben. How do you know who? How do you know who? How do you know who's the Ben? And how do you know who's the Zerah? How do you know that that's true? You know what the Rambam writes? There's the Rambam in Perek Yud Hilchos Malachim. You know what the Rambam writes? It's a little bit frightening. Last Shabbos is Kriyas Torah. No? Whoever would receive the bracha, that is the Rai Muchachas, that they are the Zerah. Wow. And Yaakov received the bracha. Oh, so that's the Raya, that Yaakov is the Zerah Avram, and Esav is the Ben Avram, the Ben Yitzchak, but not the Zerah. The bracha. You know what's so frightening about that? The apparent willingness of Yitzchak to give the bracha to Esav. Like really? And it required incredible intervention. If a bracha is a bracha, okay. But if the bracha is going to determine who is the Zerah and who is the Ben, it sounds inconceivable that Esav would have been the Zerah Avram. If not for everything that the Torah describes, how could that possibly be? So I'll tell you just a minute, and I'll stop. No, the answer I think is this. Take a look at Rabbi Yonah, and take a look at the Alshich here. In this past Shabbos is Kriyas Torah. There's something very unusual. Yitzchak is about to bestow a bracha. Okay. And what is the bracha? The bracha is Tal HaShamayim Mishmani Haaretz. You know what Rabbi Yonah writes? That's very unusual. That's wrong. That's not the bracha. That's not the bracha that Yitzchak received from Avram Avinu. The bracha that Yitzchak received from Avram Avinu was Bris Milah and Torah and Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Migorecha, Yerusha, Morasha. And all of a sudden, he's giving a bracha of Tal HaShamayim Mishmani Haaretz. That sounds so odd. Now, here is Yitzchak giving a bracha, and he is withholding the bracha that was given to Avram Avinu. So Rabbi Yonah Alshich right, because Yitzchak thought he was speaking to Esau, and Yitzchak's mindset was the following: I have Zerah and I have Ben. Zerah is Yaakov, but I have a Ben who's the Ish Yodei Tzayid. What's wrong with giving Esau the bracha of Tal HaShamayim Mishmani Haaretz? That bracha are things. That bracha is materialism. No, that bracha is bounty. That bracha is wealth. Why does Yaakov Avinu need that? Why does Yaakov Avinu need that? I'll tell you why it's so especially profound. Because you know what Rashi writes? You know what Yitzchak was? Yitzchak was, right, a carbon ola. No? Yitzchak was an ola tamima. I'll tell you a medrash. It's incredible. Take the Bereishis Rabbah, Samach Zayin. Avram Avinu was about to sacrifice Yitzchak, and all of a sudden an ayil appears. What does the pasuk say? Vayeyil Allah, tachas beno. Tachas, that word tachas is incredible. No? Tachas. That's the Midrash, Samach Zayin. A person is makdish a karbanola, and you say, Zeh tachazeh. You know what happens? Hu smrasa yeh kodesh. B becomes kadosh, but A remains kadosh. It's a tmura. That's mafurish and medrash. No? Tachas beno means Zeh tachazeh. That means Yitzchak retained that status. That status comparable to karbanola. That's why Kadosh Baruch Hu says, don't you dare leave Eretz Yisrael. There's a psuyotze. Your father left that true, but you're a karbanos. Let me ask you the following. There's certain karbanos, part of it is the gavoa, part of it there's achilas habayim. A karbanola is kula Hashem. That's who Yitzchak was. The Netziv writes, he was dome lamalach Hashem mora ma'od. And the Netziv writes, you have to read the Netziv very, very carefully in Parachav Dalet, but the Netziv writes, that's why the relationship of Yitzchak and Rivka was not a typical relationship, because Rivka was overawed by Yitzchak, because literally he was a karban ola hadom lamalach Hashem tzvakos. Wow. So imagine that's who Yitzchak was. And imagine there's a bracha of mishmani haaretz. What is Yitzchak going to do with the bracha of mishmani haaretz? No? So I have a son is Esav. Let him at least get that bracha. You'll ask Yitzchak, you're really going to give him the status of Zerah? You know what Yitzchak is going to tell you? Rahman al-Islam, the Birchas Avram, where's the Birchas Avram found in the Parsha? Only in the very end of the Parsha. Vayitinachas Birchas Avram. That's at the very end of the Parsha, when Yitzchak knew that he was speaking to Yaakov Avinu. That was not up for grabs. The Birchas Avram was only going to go to Yaakov Avinu. That was clear. And Yitzchak just thought that, you know what, you can have that dichotomy. And that's also a very, very important hashkafa. The intervention of Rivka and Yaakov, Siyata Dishmaya, Hashkachas Hashem, is that only the Zerah Avram, who possesses the Birchas Avram, can have dominion over Talas Shema Mishman Aretz. These are not two independent domains, but rather, you know what? A Sulam, Uzarsa, Rosh Magia Shemaima, a Chibur, a Shiluv, a confluence, a convergence of the bracha of Zerah Avram together with the Tal HaShema Mishman Aretz. So I'll tell you, look back at that Rambam in Perek Gidaf Hilchos Malachim. How do you know who indeed is the Zerah Avram? You know what the Rambam writes? The one who would receive the bracha. The Rambam is mafurish. The bracha of V'yitenacha es Birchas Avram. The later bracha in the parsha, not Tal HaShema Mishman Aretz. The later bracha, that of course Yitzchak always single-mindedly was going to give to Yaakov Avinu. And our mission is the Shiluv, right? The confluence of both of those brachos. That's like an amazing ha'ara. That Tosas is Chiddush, recognize the difference between Zerah and Ben, and we are Zochet to be the Zerah Avram. Torah and Morasha and Bris Milah, Lazarach Hanasate Yasaretz Azos. Recognize that it is uniquely ours. B'nai Yishmael, B'nai Esav have no claim, no status. The most they can claim is being a Ben, because Ben includes Posel, and Ben ends after a single generation. No? Those are two nafkaminas that indeed Tosas writes. That's an important ta'ara to take a look. It's an achrayis, the privilege of being the Zerah Avram. And that means, you have to kind of make sure the bar is incredibly high. You're here, you're privileged to be Osek B'Torah. You know what? You have to master what you're learning. No, every year I come here, I tell you the same thing. No, you have to finish the Masechta. You're going to tell me it's hard. Okay, you know what? You have Ben Azmanim. You have summers. You have to have a goal to finish the Masechta. And you know what? You have to chazer incessantly. Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't create us that we learn something once and remember it. And the Gemara Menachos of Tzadi Test, it's an Issa D'Oraisa to forget your learning. The Gemara says, you know what? Onus Rachman Apatre. Sometimes you try your best and you forget. That happens. But you know what? If you learn something and don't chazer it time and time again, that's not an onus. No? An onus means when something happens like unexpected, out of the blue. I'm going to tell you, if you don't chazer, you know what? You're not going to retain that which you're learning. And the Torah is so precious, has to become part of you. Kihim chayenu. So you have to learn, you have to chazer, and there's one more thing you have to do. Need a daf ayin beis. You have to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for siyata d'shmaya. Befurish in Gemara, You're not going to be matzliach in learning unless a person davens earnestly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By definition, you can't succeed in learning without tefillah. You're going to tell me, how do you know? How do I know? It's a Gemara Mufareshes, newmedia.haretzion. Hablo halo sagi. That's very important. Kadosh Baruch Hu will determine. You position yourself in life. You're mishtadel. But you don't control anything about the outcome of what you do. Kadosh Baruch Hu controls the outcome of all your actions. And that, the Gemara says, is a shiluv of your hishtadlus and your koach hatfilah. You have to be mishtadel and you have to be mispalel. If all you do is your mispalel, the Gemara says that's not enough. But if all you do is position yourself without the koach hatfilah, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Unfortunately, sometimes you see in a Bnei Yeshiva, they take learning so seriously. But you know what? The davening, sometimes they cut corners. And you have to just realize, it's clear. Without that koach hatfilah, you're not going to be matzliach in learning. That's clear. And it's not only learning. I'll go out on a limb, you're not going to succeed in life unless you're mispalo to Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu controls everything. Hakol b'gzeres alyon. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks us, amelus, hasmada, hishtadlus, but also you have to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for siyata d'shma. You do this, all of a sudden things start to change. You start to overreach. There are no ceilings when it comes to learning. You can overreach and accomplish things that you thought I was never capable of. As long as you realize that, all of that is beyond Hashem. I have to responsibly position myself, and all of a sudden, it be zochet to incredible nisim al yedei koach hatfilah. So take it as seriously as you can, right? Use every moment of the zman simply to engage in avodas Hashem. Be mishtadel, be mispalel, and Bezras Hashem be zochet to incredible siyata d'shmaya.